Hey guys, Matthew here, and today we're going to be looking at my actual league starter for the upcoming 3.18 Sentinel League. So this is what I'm personally going to be going for. Now, before anything else, I want to say I'm sorry for my voice, and if I'm all over the place, I definitely am in great need of sleep right now. I don't feel that great, but I wanted to get this video out for you guys before actually heading out for the night, or for the morning. It's like 5 a.m., but whatever. So what we're going to start off with is just a quick showcase of what this build can actually do. Now, I made a video last league called Seismic Trap is the king of bossing or something, and as you can see, the name of this video is the exact same thing, and that was actually for a reason. It's because I truly believe that this build is still the king of bossing. Now, they haven't nerfed anything about it, they haven't buffed anything about it. I've personally came up with changes which I think are buffs, especially when it comes to the price of the build. I've definitely been able to cut down on a lot of things in order to make the build cheaper, especially on the high end. On the low end, it was already dirt cheap to get it started, as you'll see in this showcase here. So before anything else, I'll just showcase what that looks like. We're going to be hopping into a Maven's Rip. Now, I'm not going to do the whole thing because that would take too long. I'll just do like the first phase. And before that, I'll showcase my gear. So this is just stuff I had laying around that I threw together. My estimation of this entire gear in like day one of a league is something like an Exalt maybe. Like this one is like 5 Chaos. It's just one stat, right? Or 2 stats, 1.5, whatever. It's got the +1 all and a little bit or a decent amount of crit chance to spells. Nothing else on there matters. The cast speed, for example, doesn't do anything. The prod speed either. And then there's crafted spell damage, of course. This one is even worse somehow. It's got +1 to physical spells and then the 75 spell damage from the Essence on top of a Driftwood one, which is like the worst base in the game. So it only has a total of like 80 spell damage, literally nothing else. Crafted lightning resistance of all things. Now the helmet is just life and resistance with suppression, no enchant. Gloves, same thing, life, res, suppression, no enchant. These are also prior to Eldritch in terms of items, so they don't even have like any Eldritch enchants or anything like that. Life resistance on the belt with a bit of trap throwing speed. Deerstalkers, no enchant. 1 alch boots, whatever. The amulet is 70 life, 25 multi, literally nothing else with crafted throwing speed. It's potency that I have allocated here as the Anoint, so very, very cheap Anoint as well. No plus levels, nothing like that. Tabula is corrupted with actually nothing. The gem level of my Seismic Trap is going to be level 21, no quality, and the rest of my gems are 2020. The rings and stuff are just life and resistances, stuff that I had laying around, not adding any damage. Now we are going to be doing this with no cluster whatsoever, so not even a medium cluster, which is pretty bad because Seismic definitely benefits a lot from cluster jewels. Really good way to scale the build, as we'll get into the PoB later on. And the jewels themselves are basically life single multi, so life multi here, life multi here, life multi whatever, right? So very, very cheap. Again, probably like an Exalt for the entire set of gear in a league start scenario. I'm talking like the first day of a league. So this is what you can expect from gear that you just pick up off the ground. Now, looking at the defensive layers of this build, obviously we'll talk about that later on in PoB, but we have Grace Determination defines Banner, which is like the baseline of any good defenses on any character. And then to go further on that, we also have Cap Spell Suppression, which is really, really kind of a mandatory thing almost nowadays, especially for bossing builds. Obviously, we're going to be capped on resistances, and we have positive chaos resistance, mostly because of these nodes over here, and maybe like 1 chaos roll somewhere on my gear. I have no idea where. So we're going to go ahead and do the first phase of the Maven, like I said. Not going to do the whole thing, too long. But the first phase alone should be enough to show like the sort of damage and survivability this build has. I'm going to try to purposely fake stank some of the mechanics, not like the whole thing, but just a little bit to showcase that you don't have to play perfectly on a build like this. Now, in terms of the combo, what we're going to do is we're going to throw down Assassin's Mark, which is permanent now. It's going to give us crit multi and a bunch of crit chance on the boss. And then we are going to throw down our Bear Trap, throw down all of our Seismic Traps on top of the boss directly, and then just spam Exsanguinate in order to generate power charges from High Explosive and Frenzy charges from Master Sapper. And also regen from our Ascendancy. So that's kind of the what's going on. So very simple build to play. But yeah, let's get right into it. And then after the first phase, we're going to hop right into the PoB because there's a lot to talk about on the PoB. And I don't want this video to be too long. Okay, so like I was saying, Assassin's Mark first. Then we're going to wait for her to TP, Bear Trap, throw down our Seismic, and then just spam away on the, what's it called? On the Exsanguinates. So I'm going to face tank a couple Cascade of Pains here. Let's see. I don't want to get actually frozen though from that, so I'm going to be a little careful. But yeah, this is sort of the damage. Now, yeah, okay, I'm not one-shotting her, but I also have like 1 Exalt worth of gear, so let's see if we can take that. Yes, we can. Pretty good there. So again, you really don't have to play perfectly, right? This sort of build is very good for people who are not going to be sleeping a lot on their league start because they're complete degenerates and they don't want to go to bed because that would mean not farming currency for, you know, a few hours. So this is what you can expect. In my opinion, this is still right now the king of bossing, especially on a budget, because if it can do that sort of, you know, content and this easily on this budget, imagine if you throw even just like 5x at it, 10x at it. It gets crazy. And let's get into PoB, and I'm going to showcase exactly just how crazy it gets. So what you'll find in the description of this video is a PoB which has everything. Now, one thing that I learned when making this PoB, which is actually why I'm making this video so late, is that you can actually put a lot of stuff in a single PoB. I typically make multiple different PoBs with multiple price points and multiple trees, and it gets kind of crazy and there's just too many links. And turns out you could put literally everything together. So what you'll find in the PoB down below is a PoB which has the full Lvling guide in the notes section. Now you'll see that this was copy pasted from the previous league one because nothing's changed. I haven't changed anything in terms of how to level the build. It was already very smooth. There was no reason to change anything about it. In the skills section, you'll find 2 main blocks. The first block is going to be prior to getting Devouring Diadem, and the big change is that prior to Devouring Diadem, we're going to be using Lifetap, which is going to make it so our skills cost life instead of mana, because Seismic Trap would be very mana hungry, and that would not be possible. But life is very easy because we can regen that pretty easily because of, again, our Ascendancy. And then eventually, when you do get Devouring Diadem, what's going to change is we're no longer to use Lifetap, because I'll talk about how Devouring Diadem works when we get to that. But that's going to change, which allows us to get 1 better support instead. And another thing is we'll be able to add multiple other actual auras to the build when we get Devouring Diadem because of the amount of mana that it actually gives us back from the 25% reservation efficiency on top of other things. But first things first, another thing that you're going to find after the notes section, right, is the leveling trees. So under the trees section, there's actually a lot of them. So as you can see right here, there's many trees that I've prepared for you guys. So obviously there's going to be my usual leveling trees, you know, Brutus, Merveil, Valiver, Soul, which are all the bosses in the different acts, right? Dominus, Act 3, Kitava, Act 5, Blood Aqueducts, right? And then eventually around level 75 is when you will make the swap from Elemental, because we're going to level with Elemental. It's way smoother, into Physical. Now, if you wanted to say go to Physical earlier, right? Let's say you don't like Elemental and you're like, what do I need if I want to play Physical as early as possible? I don't want to use the other traps. I just want to use Seismic. Essentially, the only thing you really need is the wands. You know, like I just showcased wands with like +1 Physical, which are going to give an extra level to Seismic. That's really all you need. I would probably recommend waiting until you have a Tabula or at least a 5-link. I don't think I would recommend going to like Fizz on a 4-link, but by the time that you get level 75, which is around the time you hit like T7, T8 maps maybe, you should be doing Chaos Recipe. I highly recommend you should be doing Chaos Recipe at the start of the league, which means you should have enough currency to buy Tabula around that time and have your, you know, 2 to 5 Chaos Wands around that time. So that should not be a problem. You should definitely have enough to swap into Fizz. So another thing is that I made sure that there's not a single regret point that you would or single regret orb that you would need when you change from Elemental to Physical. Just the regrets that you get, or the respec points that you get from the story, will be enough, because the only thing that you're respecing is essentially these nodes over here. So you'll have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 nodes, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So like 14 nodes total. Everything else is pretty much the exact same. These nodes are actually all going to go into this stuff over here. So instead of, you know, connecting the tree at the top, we're going to go at the bottom through the physical nodes, through the physical nodes, through the physical nodes, and the rest of the tree is the same. This is all 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 the same. So again, you should not need a single regret, which is really nice for your economy. Now the trees also have the Ascendancies and the Bandits included. So we are going to be going with Alira pretty much for the entire game. Now, when you're super endgame, you can actually swap this out to 2 passive points if you want to. But I think even on when I was doing feared carries last league, I was still using Alira on my build. So Alira is really good. You benefit from the multi, you benefit from the resistances, and overall, think about it this way: if there's a single node that you can get on your tree, 2 nodes, which basically a jewel socket that you can get, which will give you more than 15 multi and 15 multi and 15 all res, then it's better to drop and to get 2 skill points. But the reality is that's kind of impossible because there's no jewel sockets that are close enough. But again, if you have a jewel that's good enough, you could totally do that. But yeah, I go with Alira. Now, in terms of the Ascendancy, Pyromaniac first, Perfect Crime second, Chain Reaction third, and the 4th one will be Born in the Shadows, which is the defensive one. You'll see that this build is very damage-oriented earlier on, especially during the story and during the early portion of it. And as you go further on, we're going to start stacking layers of defense when we really need them. You don't really need, Grace, Determination, Defiance, Banner in Act 3. That's just overkill. But you will need those things once we get into, deep yellows and early red maps. So that's kind of how I build the character. Okay, so there's the physical respec. Now, the next 3 is going to be a level 90 tree with no clusters. So maybe for solo self-found players, maybe if you just don't have the currency, maybe if you're currently trying to roll one of your clusters so that you can start using them and whatnot, this is what your tree will look like. And eventually around level 92 is what I predicted, you should have, or you potentially will have, a cluster set up. So this is what it'll look like. You'll have basically what we're dropping is this stuff over here, which is all resistances here, as well as armor and evasion, and a bunch of life. Now, one thing that you'll see change here is that the previous setup has about 4.5k life. The setup with the large cluster has 4,000 life. So we're dropping a lot of life, but our damage is also 30% higher, right? So if I hover over this, you'll see that if I was to remove all this, I lose 30.9% of my damage. So this cluster setup, this large and double mediums with the two jewels over here, is 1/3 of my damage, right? So this cluster is a lot of damage, which is why I personally always go for it. But if you're somebody who doesn't mind having a little bit less damage, and you'd rather be more tanky, and it's also much cheaper not going for the clusters, you can definitely stay on this side of the tree. It also makes itemization a little bit easier because you get 40 strength, 20 from Path of the Warrior, and 20 strength here, which means you don't have to worry about getting as much strength on your gear or on your tree. Okay, next we have another setup, which is the high budget setup. This is the final tree, which is level 93 in this case. Now, what's going to change with the high budget setup is we are going to be swapping from the life base, where we're using Lifetap, right, our life to actually cast our Seismic, into Devouring Diadem, which is Eldritch Battery, which at this point our energy shield is going to protect our mana, and our energy shield is going to actually be what's going to allow us to cast spells. So the upsides of that is that it's very easy to have basically infinite mana, if you will, because Energy Shield is constantly regenning as long as you're not getting hit, and which is going to prevent the regenning. But the thing is, since it's protecting your mana, as long as you're not Mind Over Matter, you're never getting hit, right? Your mana pool is never ever getting hit, even if your life pool is getting hit by enemies, so it's just constantly regenning. So it's kind of impossible to really run out of Energy Shield as long as you have around 400 or so, even despite the fact that, Seismic is like 100 mana at that point. But what changes once you go there is that we are going to lose Arcane Surge. Now, Arcane Surge is what you have on, say, Flame Dash. You Flame Dash, it costs mana, it procs Arcane Surge. The thing is, because your skills no longer cost mana, they cost Energy Shield, you can't proc Arcane Surge anymore. So what you will have to do is instead use this cluster notable here on medium clusters with, of course, the trap and mind damage ones, which is Arcane Pyrotechnics, which gives you Arcane Surge when your trap is triggered by an enemy. So as long as you're not throwing your traps completely away from your enemy all the time, as long as sometimes they're actually being triggered by the enemy, it's going to proc, and it's going to be nice because it's Arcane Surge is 10% more damage. So one notable 10% damage, definitely really, really hard to beat. Now, the other notable that you really, really care about is going to be Set and Forget, and this is through all the different variations of this build. Set and Forget is the ultimate medium cluster node for 2 reasons. First off, well, it's pretty good because of the trap damage and the area of effect. Now, area of effect, the way that it works right now is that the more you have, the more dispersed your explosions are, but the more you have, the bigger your explosions are. So it's kind of like this relationship where you can't just scale a ton of AoE to have like massive explosions because they're going to be further apart, but at the same time, even though they're further apart because they're bigger, they still end up having around the same amount of overlap. So personally, for my testing with Conk Effect versus like Ink AoE versus even Awakened Ink AoE, I didn't really see that much of a difference in terms of the damage. So it really is personal preference. But another good thing is the reduced trap duration. Now, this is a bit counterintuitive because the way that Seismic Trap works is that it scales off of duration, which is why you'll see that I get exceptional performance for skill effect duration. So you might think that this is counterintuitive because I'm getting more duration here and then I'm reducing the duration here, but it's actually not the case. Reduced trap duration is not the same as reduced skill effect duration. Skill effect duration is what's going to affect the actual time that the skill lasts. So the amount of basically explosions your Seismic Trap is able to do. Trap duration is just going to affect the amount of time the trap can sit on the ground before it explodes, before it actually starts blowing up. So by having a bunch of reduced trap duration, when you throw your Seismic Trap on the ground, it's going to take less time for it to arm and less time for it to start blowing up, which means you won't have to aim it directly under the enemy's feet. Even if you throw it pretty much anywhere, it'll still blow up, which can be nice. Especially if you're stacking a ton of AoE, because the thing is, if you're stacking a bunch of AoE, those big explosions I was talking about are going to be very far away from each other, and that means that the circle, which is where the trigger happens, is typically never going to really get hit by anything. I'm talking if you have like a lot of AoE. So this is beneficial because you can kind of throw your traps anywhere. It's going to hit the entire arena, but you don't have to aim them. So this is why we go set and forget, and of course the trap trigger area of effect, because you need at least some, and because we're not going with the regular expedition munitions and unstable munitions, this is going to make up for that. The other node, which is pretty much going to be our best node, is Guerilla Tactics, other than the one Arcane Pyrotechnics. Otherwise, it's Guerilla Tactics and set and forget all the way. Now, Guerilla Tactics, trap damage, good. Trap throwing speed, very good. This is going to affect the number of times that our actual the speed, I should say, at which our seismic explodes. And the faster it explodes, basically the more damage we get out of a single trap. So that's why this one is really good. And it's also nice because the move speed, if you've thrown a trap or mine recently, this is just good quality of life, both for your mapping experience, but also for your bossing. It's going to allow you to get out of dodge faster, especially if you're, out of movement skill charges like your flame dash, for example. So that's kind of how we're going on in terms of the cluster jewels. Now, the large one, basically on the budget setup, we are not going to be getting the node at the back, so it's going to be pretty budget. It's Master of Fundamentals, Battle Hardened, and First Assault. This should not be very expensive. It's really easy to craft. Minimum item level 50 on the cluster jewel to get all three of these notables, and there's two ways to go about it. You could spam jagged fossils at it, or you could also just do physical reforges and harvest, and again, they're very, very common. Now, the higher end budget, we are going to go for the node at the back, so this is going to change a little bit. It's going to be Master of Fundamentals, Battle Hardened, and Force Multiplier. Now, Force Multiplier is going to make it significantly harder to craft, and also I believe it's going to require level 68 instead of 50, but 5% double damage is insane. 5% double damage is just 5% more damage in one node. Remember what I was saying about Arcane Pyrotechnics? 10% damage is one node is like the best you can ever ask for. Well, this is 7.6% more damage, so it's very close compared to these ones, which are like 4%. So that's kind of what you can expect out of the large cluster jewels. Now, let's finally look at the actual items themselves, because once again, I've prepared multiple different sets. You'll have the League Starter set, which is going to be gear similar to what I just showcased on that Maven right there. So, one or two stats and then something crafted on your wands. Life, Resistance, Suppress on the helmet. A Tabula, Life Suppress Resistance on the gloves. Deerstalker is going to be the boots of choice. Life, Multi, Trap Throwing Speed on the amulet. And then the rings are going to be just life and resistances. I don't know if you'll actually need this intelligence. I'm not sure why it's there. I really don't think you'll need that. Maybe it's just for the wands, probably, actually. Because we are not going that high on the tree, right? We're not going all the way up. We're just getting this stuff here. We're actually going to need some intelligence somewhere on our gear, and rings is a good place to get it because it's typically not valued highly. But it depends on what kind of wands you have. Some wands have very high intelligence requirements. Some wands don't. So yeah, and then the belt, life, resistance, trap throwing speed crafted. Obviously, we're going to use a life flask, a jade, and a granite. So the jade, it doesn't matter the suffixes where they are, but we'll want some evasion during flask effect, some armor during flask effect, some crit chance during flask effect, as well as a diamond flask, and then a quicksilver, again, for moving out of dodge and for better mapping, as well as curse effectiveness, reduced effective curses during flask effect. So this is kind of the flask setup that I personally always go for. I don't ever move away from this. It is really, really good for keeping you safe, because the thing about determination and grace that a lot of people kind of tend to forget is that, yes, determination and grace are good for defenses, but if you have no anything backing it up, because they're mostly like percentage, yes, they add some amount of flat, but they're mostly percentage, like multipliers or whatever, they don't do that much. So by having a jade and a granite to further increase the amount of flat that we have and the percent, it makes it for decent amount of defenses, even with gear as bad as this. So this is kind of what we're rocking on the actual budget setup. This is what it looks like. Okay, now let's look at the actual medium budget. So this is where probably around 10x, maybe a little bit more. It really depends on the meta and how expensive cold iron points are, and the skin of the lords and the Azuri step. But of course, we're going to go with 2 cold iron points. These are our endgame weapons for the physical version of this build. Very cheap, comparatively to say a mirror tier elemental weapon, for the amount of power that it gives you. 30% more damage for these weapons, so very, very solid. Then of course, helmet's going to be the same, life, resistance, suppress, but we're going to go with the enchant +1 wave. So +1 wave is the small waves. I get this question a bunch of time. When it says Seismic Trap releases 1 additional wave, is it 1 more pop? Because, sometimes when you stack a lot of trap throwing speed and a lot of duration, you'll get like 11, 12, 13, 14. So 1 additional wave would be very little in terms of damage, but it's not. It's one of the additional small waves, which initially you have 5 of, so this makes it 6. So this is a pretty big deal. Definitely the best enchant. Skin of the Lords, definitely what I would go for. You can also go for Skin of the Lords, Skin of the Loyal, but that only has a +1 to socketed gems instead of a +2, but it does have the global defenses. The advantage of going with the Skin of the Loyal is that you can actually get good corruptions, which can make it significantly better than a Skin of the Lords instead, but a lot of the time it's going to be a lot more expensive as well. Gloves, at this point we're going to go with some Shaper gloves for the trap support. Now this socketed gems are supported by level 20 trap, can also be trap and mind damage support. It just means that instead of running trap and mind damage support, you would run trap support, but they're interchangeable. Because at this point we're no longer going to use Deerstalkers, we're going to use Azuri's Step for the big suppress, the big evasion, and life and move speed as well. And the enchant crit chance, if you haven't crit recently, is extremely strong, by far the best we can get on this build, because we wouldn't benefit from the lightning damage if you haven't crit or killed an enemy recently or whatever, which most elemental builds would rather have. For this build, it's all about the crit chance if you haven't crit recently. Now, one thing that changes on the medium budget is our amulet is essentially the exact same, except it also has +1 to physical skill gems. Now, these amulets should be no more than 50C, maybe an Exalt. It should be very cheap to get an amulet like that. Don't go overpaying. It's not +2. It's nothing special. The rings are actually the exact same, and so is the belt. So are the flasks. And in the medium budget setup, nothing changes on the actual PoB whatsoever. Now, looking at the high budget when it comes to this build, there's going to be quite a few changes. First off, cold iron points is still going to be our go-to, still going to be our endgame weapons, still by far the best we can expect. Devouring Diadem at this point is what we'll be using. This is where Eldritch Battery comes into play, where we cast using our energy shield instead of life or mana. This is nice because with Devouring Diadem and a Skin of the Lords or a Skin of the Loyal, that alone will give you around 400 energy shield, which is plenty enough to be able to cast basically as many seismics or flame dashes or whatever ever, right? You'll never run out of energy shield because it's constantly regenning. Now, body armor, same thing as always. The gloves, this is actually a bit of a change. We are going to be reverting to some actual rare gloves that are not going to be shapered, because we're going to go with the new Eldritch currency. This is going to give us life and suppress gloves, but on top of that, we can get more suppression from the implicit and also unnerved. Now, unnerved is something like 10% more damage as well, which is why we're going to be reverting to these gloves. And we're also going to be reverting to Deerstalkers. Now, Deerstalkers at this point, hopefully you're able to find some with an enchant of 120 crit chance, which is what we had on the Azuri's boots. Now, why we're reverting here is because of the unnerved as well as the fact that it's really hard to get a pair of suppression gloves with shaper influence on them, but it's really easy to get a pair of gloves like that, and the suppression and the implicit being added to the suppression on the gloves themselves make it very, very easy to cap out or spell suppression. So that's kind of where we're doing that. Now the amulet, this is where it's going to get a little bit pricey. This might be the most pricey item on the entire PoB, honestly, is the Ashes of Stars with a perfect reservation efficiency roll. Now, don't get too scared about the reservation efficiency roll. It's a 1 in 11 divines on average to actually get it. Now, you will need to get a perfect one. As you can see, I have 1 unreserved mana right now, so it's absolutely mandatory. Or you'll see later on, you'll just need a higher level Enlighten, but I wanted to try to cut out a high level Enlighten, even level 3. I wanted to keep it at level 2 to really make it cheap. If you get a level 3 Enlighten, which is relatively not that expensive, you will no longer need a perfect Ashes of Stars, but instead I'll have another solution, or another thing that I would personally do, which is get better rings instead. So this is still sort of somewhat budget. It's not like super basically as expensive as it gets, because the Circle of Guilt rings are actually somewhat cheap. They are the physical damage while affected by Herald of Purity, but also Herald of Purity has 35% mana reservation efficiency. So instead of these having the double damage from the buff effect and the fizz damage, they have the reservation efficiency, which is what allows us to go with a very low level Enlighten. Now, like I was saying, you won't need a perfect Ashes of Stars if you want to basically get a higher level Enlighten, but if you do get a level 4 Enlighten, you can actually change this back to get the buff effect instead, which I believe is something like 12% more damage over both rings. So it's actually quite a bit of damage, but Enlighten level 4, very expensive. Not only that, your Circle of Guilts are also going to become way more expensive because these are really cheap. Either buff effect or fizz damage while affected by Herald of Purity and the reservation efficiency, that's really cheap. But when we're going for buff effect and fizz damage, that's really expensive. Multiple exalts. I believe last league they went all the way up to like 8 exalts or something with nothing else on there. No good implicits or anything crazy. So it can get really pricey. This is super cheap. All you need to do is divine yourself an Ashes of the Stars and you're good to go. The belt, at this point, we're going to be changing to a Stygian Vise, but realistically, it's just because we need more resistances, and a Stygian Vise is going to offer more resistances than the previous heavy belt that we were using. Otherwise, I already spoke about the setup in terms of the cluster jewels for the high budget, so that's pretty much all there is. Nothing else really changes. Now, one thing that you might be wondering is, what is this jewel here? Because I don't think I mentioned it, because this is a jewel that we don't really use anymore, called Inertia. And what Inertia does is it gives you dexterity from passes and radius is transformed into strength. And the cool thing about this is that this specific spot right here basically gives us 100 strength. It's pretty crazy the amount of strength that we get from this because there's so many dexterity in the radius. So this is just going to make it super easy to gear because we do need like 155 strength, and it's fairly hard to get when we have this many uniques. So by just going with the Inertia Jewel, it fixes that problem. However, when we do go with the Inertia Jewel, one thing is that we will lose some suppression due to Magebane. We have less dexterity, means we have less spell suppression. So when we do that, we will need to get probably Quick Step in order to cap out our spell suppression once again. But to be honest, Quick Step are not bad nodes. Move Speed is not horrible. It's going to allow you to, again, just move out of these sticky situations when you're bossing, and also, you know, a better experience when you're mapping. But these are pretty much this is pretty much everything you have to know about Seismic Trap. Now, I will have another video, probably something like a few days into the league, on cold conversion Seismic Trap, because I would not recommend it as a league starter. The gear that it requires is just a lot more specific and a lot harder to acquire than the physical version. And also, I haven't made the PoB. And I already have a lot of builds and stuff to prepare for league start, but hopefully if you're looking for a build that is going to be able to tackle the new endgame, uber elder, and, you know, uber maven, and uber, you know, all that stuff, this is definitely a build to look into. It has the defenses, as you can see here, especially when you get to the higher budget version, you know, 40,000 armor, 40,000 evasion, pretty, you know, easily. Now this is 35, but you could easily make it higher than that. Cap suppression, cap resistance, positive chaos res without you know, without like an Amethyst Flask or anything like that. And this is also at level 93. We could definitely go higher level than that. We could definitely push a lot more damage. This doesn't have any, you know, alternate quality gems, doesn't have any awakened gems, doesn't have 21 23s. It has a level 2 Enlighten. Like I said, if you push for a level 4 Enlighten here, what you can actually do is go back to your circle of guilds and push more damage into those as well. So we can actually lose this reservation here and change it to, let's see, skill reservation into buff effect, I believe. So as you can see here, we'll lose like 12 mana. So even if we do that on both our rings, we'll still have positive mana. And this is another, you know, as I was saying, something like 12% damage that you'll be gaining on your build. So something to look out for. You could easily push that more with corruptions on a lot of the items. For example, this 30% crit chance on the Ezomite daggers. This could be instead spell damage as a corruption, which would be much better. Devouring Diadem could have like corruption, obviously, or Skin of the Lords could be a Skin of the Loyal with like +4. That would be another like 20% damage. There's still a lot of things you could do to push this build. Bottled Faith is obviously the one that a lot of people would go for. So this is sort of a build that I think is going to be very, very good to tackle all of the new content. And if it's a build that you've already played, or that, you know, you just don't really feel like playing a Trapper build, that's perfectly fine. I'll have a build tomorrow out on how to league start as Omni TS, which is the build that I pushed really, really far last league. But of course, you will not be able to league start with Tornado Shot. You'll be league starting with Spectral Helix Deadeye, but we're going to get into that tomorrow. Anyways, hopefully you guys enjoy the video. Before I go, as always, I want to say a massive thank you to my patrons. So Rescoral, Brendan, welcome back, Thomas Mass, Nate, The Great Master, Alex, Tim, Mercury, Johnny, Novgarl, Somonk, Exo, Jero Costa, and Bizen, as well as, of course, anyone else who has supported me in the past, and anyone else who wishes to remain anonymous. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. I'll be Matthew signing out. Peace.